And he begins by talking about the Enlightenment as that attempt or that dream to consolidate knowledge that ultimately failed. And he sees as paradigmatic here a kind of model figure, the Marquis de Condorcet, and suggests that this was a man who was a polymath. He was educated in a number of areas, particularly math, and ultimately his contribution to sociology was the application of mathematics to social sciences. That he was a progressivist, a perfectibilist. He believed that we could actually perfect our lives in the way that we interact with each other. But as was the mark of the French Revolution, he was ultimately killed. And the French Revolution, which seemed in some ways, at least at the beginning, to embody these ideals of the Enlightenment, also failed. And he locates the source of that failure, of the Enlightenment, and of that desire, that dream of consilience, in its own design. He suggests that this design may have had a fatal flaw. And you recall, he notes that if we really do believe that knowledge can be consolidated, if we really believe a perfect society can be constructed, then that can lead us to the exclusion of any idea, oppositional ideas, or those outside. And so it becomes ultimately a fascistic or a tyrannical state, which is indeed historically the case. From that point, he also introduces at that time a couple of other metaphors. He talks again about how science has been perceived, often with a kind of distrust. He invokes Shelley's Frankenstein, and in fact, as in some ways a manifestation of this fear of science, or science gone wrong. In some cases, he's a little reductive as he goes through this chapter. Misreads Frankenstein actually a little bit, as we talked about in my class. A number of students knew Frankenstein ultimately turns violent because of failure of love, rather than just science gone wrong. But it serves as an example of how we have this inherent distrust of science. He says we had evolved really to believe in the gods. We didn't evolve to believe in science, which is something that will become clearer to us in a little bit. He goes then through a kind of survey of important, beginning with Bacon, of important figures in the development of science, and moves through historically then the Enlightenment and Romanticism and modernism and postmodernism. And it's postmodernism that I want to spend a few minutes talking about, because that's especially important at the end of that chapter in his discussion, because he's going to have to reject it. He's going to have to reject postmodernism, which he sees, again, in a kind of reductive way, as simply the idea that there are competing narratives or versions of reality. And given that, we're reduced to a kind of meaningless relativity. We can't decide which has a greater validity. Anything goes, and so he sees it as sort of the mark of chaos, which, as I say, is sort of scants the real complexities and nuances of postmodernism. But he has to do this. He has to reject postmodernist perspective, because it would call into question even the validity of science. It would see scientific reasoning and scientific methodology as another what is referred to as meta-narrative, another way of seeing reality or construing reality. That science, what you determine in science, is based upon the kinds of questions you're asking and the instruments that are being used and so on, and that there may be other realities that are competing. He has to reject that because, of course, the basis of his argument is his sense of ontology. What is real for him is the material. He's a materialist. And so the way to knowledge is epistemology, is that which comes through empiricism, the testing then of matter, the testing of the physical world. And that then gives you a kind of absolute truth, an arguable truth, fact, that's not subject to philosophical variation or argumentation. After this chapter, then he moves on to chapter 4, the natural sciences, which also is an important chapter, not only, I think, because it gives us a notion of scientific methodology, how does a scientist work, but he makes clear that the greatest gap historically is really between pre-scientific and scientific cultures. And before science, and before the development of the instrumentations of science, we were really bound by our physical senses. We really believed that reality existed only in what we could apprehend through our senses. Later, we began to understand that there are certain levels of reality, certain realities that we were just unaware of, that there is light, for instance, that exists that our optical apparatus can't see, although other animals, insects, and so on can see it. They can see pollen arising in waves through these wavelengths, and we just simply can't. Or there's a kind of aural reality that we're unaware of as well. We know that bats, for instance, can locate moths through echolocation. They can hear these sound waves, and moths can as well, and we simply had no idea. So there is this reality beyond our senses, which leads him then to the question that's based upon an older classical way of seeing human nature that we'll see in Augustine's Confessions particularly, and that's linked to what we call the hierarchy of being. With Augustine, that you'll turn to in a couple of weeks, that hierarchy of being generally runs from God and angels and humans and animal life and plant life and so on. And human life is at the top, the summit of creation. He asks the question then, given the obvious limitations of our senses, if in fact we're the summa bonum of creation, the highest good of creation, why is it that we are unaware of reality in ways that other animals, other organisms are not unaware, but they are aware of? And the answer, of course, is that we haven't needed it to survive. Moths, for instance, don't provide enough nutritional support, so that we've never had to develop the capacity to see them. That you develop, that organisms, species tend to develop that which helps them to adapt to an environment and through natural selection to progress. So he makes that point about scientific and pre-scientific cultures to again make the point that after, with the advent of science and with the advent of and development of the instruments of science, we can come to know the real nature of our lives much more precisely than we ever could have before. Consequently, we won't need to make up stories about it. Too loud or too slow? Okay, I'm sorry. You could have just hollered. Is that better? Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry about that. So that we're no longer, we no longer have to develop these kinds of stories in order to compensate for that which we don't know. That, in fact, having a greater sense of reality through science will lead us into narratives bound up in fact.